Most folks think Southern cooking is just fried chicken and biscuits, but once upon a time, every hollow, mill town, and river bend had its own way of feeding people with whatever the season gave. Food is one of the South's oldest storytellers. In this video, we'll revisit the dishes the South was still cooking in the 1960s and 70s, and slowly slipped into the background. Tomato gravy. By the 1960s, tomato gravy was still a common breakfast across rural Alabama and Mississippi. Housewives made it the same way their mothers had: bacon grease, flour, and crushed home-canned tomatoes whisked into a thick reddish sauce for biscuits. You'd see it at church breakfasts and Milltown diners, sitting right next to red-eye gravy on the stove. But it was also the moment when factory biscuits, instant grits, and packaged gravy mixes started creeping in. Television ads sold speed, not flavor. People working new factory jobs didn't have an hour for breakfast. By the late 70s, tomato gravy had gone from habit to heritage. It lingered in community cookbooks and a few roadside cafes, but it stopped being part of the daily rhythm. For families that kept the tradition, that skillet on the stove was a link back to a slower kind of South, one that measured time in coffee refills instead of time clocks. 2. Stack cake. The Appalachian stack cake was still around in the 60s, though it had already begun its retreat from weddings to reunions and homecomings. Older women baked theirs thin and filled each one with homemade apple butter, letting the cake sit overnight so the layers could soften and meld. In coal towns and farming counties, it wasn't unusual to see one wrapped in foil on a church kitchen counter. As the region modernized, soft drinks replaced cider, and Betty Crocker layer cakes started showing up in the same churches. The stack cake couldn't compete. It took hours, not minutes, and most younger women didn't bother learning to make apple butter from scratch. By the 70s, it was already being written about as old mountain food. Still, for anyone lucky enough to taste one made the old way, the flavor stayed stamped in memory. Spice cake soaked with apple syrup, tasting like the bridges between generations. Leather britches. By the mid-60s, freezers were in nearly every rural Southern home, and leather britches were already becoming rare. But a few grandmothers still made them out of habit, stringing green beans to dry on a screened porch when the weather was right. Come winter, they'd simmer them with a piece of smokehouse bacon and serve them with cornbread, not for need, but for taste. To the new generation, they seemed outdated, something fussy old folks did when they didn't trust store food. Yet the flavor was deep in the cultural DNA of mountain cooking. Beans that had absorbed smoke and summer and the slow patience of time. When those kitchens closed, the practice mostly went with them. Today you'll find scanned family recipes labeled for heritage only, but in the 70s, they were still quietly hanging by a stove or two, holding on to the past a little longer. Corn pone. In the 1960s, plenty of Southern families still kept cornmeal in bulk sacks, not boxes. Corn pone was what you made when cornbread felt too formal. No milk, no eggs, just meal, water, salt, and a skillet slicked with lard or drippings. It baked dense and crisp-edged, with a dry crumb that soaked up beans or pot liquor. By the late 70s, pone had mostly given way to boxed cornbread mix. Grocery stores started selling sweeter, cake-like versions that felt modern and easier for company fare. You didn't have to own a cast-iron skillet anymore, and many didn't. For older Southerners, though, corn pone had a texture and plainness you couldn't fake. It wasn't company food. It was weekday sustenance, something that tasted like real corn and a hard day's work. 5. Sweet milk pie. In the 60s, milk pies were still common in farm kitchens, where dairy cows kept the fridge full. Sweet milk pie was little more than eggs, sugar, and whole milk poured into a crust. A custard that settled as it cooled and set up soft as pudding. College students and factory workers who came home for Sunday supper would still find one on the counter beside coffee. By the 1970s, milk pies lost out to instant puddings and boxed custards that promised the same flavor without the weight. When home ovens turned from necessities into weekend afterthoughts. Pies like this were the first to vanish. Nowadays, it survives mostly in handwritten family books, the kind with sugar smudges in the corners, and notes like, "Don't use skim milk," ruins it. 6. Chicken mull. In the textile towns of Georgia and the Carolinas, chicken mull was the church social standby through the 60s. It was a humble soup, boiled chicken pulled apart and stirred into milk, butter, and crushed saltines until the mixture thickened into something between stew and gravy. It fed crowds cheaply, especially when paired with sandwich bread and sweet tea. But the same decade that brought television dinners also changed church gatherings. Casseroles could be baked ahead and reheated. Cream-based soups began to replace home-boiled stock. By the time Sunday potlucks went to 9 by 13 pans and store rotisserie chicken, the old white stew went quietly off the menu. Ask around Elberton or Hart County, Georgia, and someone will still have the pot for it. Blackened enamel, scaled from decades of use. But these days, it's dusted more often than filled. 7. Cooked salt fish with eggs. Down by the coastal South and Tidewater, many families kept salted herring or mackerel on hand in the 60s, a holdover from when fish was preserved in brine instead of freezers. On Saturday mornings, cooks would pick out the bones, then scramble eggs into the salty mixture. It was breakfast before the term brunch existed. By the 70s, as refrigeration and fresh seafood became cheaper, salt fish felt old-fashioned. Younger cooks found it too laborious, too salty, or too plain beside bacon and sausage. What was once everyday fare for dock workers and fishermen slowly became a relic of a self-reliant food culture, one built on the rule that if you caught it, you found a way to keep it. 8. Butter beans with dumplings. In farm kitchens, butter beans were a staple. Simmered with fatback, thickened with small flour dumplings that floated on top like soft biscuits. This dish was common in South Georgia and parts of Alabama, a supper that relied on what the garden and smokehouse already had. As families spent less time in the kitchen and more in stores, fresh butter beans gave way to canned ones, and the dumplings disappeared with them. They were simple: flour, egg, water, nothing fancy, but required you to stand over the pot, stirring carefully. Few did, once convenient sides and instant rice arrived. By the 70s, beans came from a can, dumplings from memory. 9. Hoppin' John with field peas. Before black-eyed peas took over New Year tables, most of the South used field peas for Hoppin' John. In the 1960s, that was still true in the coastal Lowcountry and southern Georgia, where smaller family gardens favored the local varieties that grew best in sandy soil. The recipe was straightforward: peas simmered with salt pork, stirred into warm rice, and finished with a dash of onion. By the mid-70s, the rise of grocery store convenience changed the ingredients. Field peas became harder to find outside farm markets, while canned black-eyed peas and parboiled rice filled the shelves. Hoppin' John went from a weeknight meal to a once-a-year tradition. The flavor shifted too: less earth, more starch. But to the last generation that cooked it the old way, field peas tasted like home before the holidays got standardized. Fried apple hand pies. In the 60s, if you stopped at a gas station or small cafe between Tennessee and North Georgia, you'd see fried apple hand pies stacked behind the counter, wrapped in wax paper. They were filled with cooked-down dried apples, heavy with cinnamon, and fried in a cast-iron skillet until the edges blistered. They lasted because they traveled well. Children carried them to school. Truckers kept them in pockets. But once grocery chains began selling boxed fruit pies and toaster pastries, the handmade kind slipped away. Shortening took the place of lard, and soon even that faded once factory pies became cheap. By the 1970s, hand pies belonged mostly to church bake sales and older gas stations, where somebody's mama still worked the fryer. For many Southerners, those little pies were the taste of road travel before fast food. Cathead biscuits. By the 1960s, every small-town cafe still served Cathead biscuits, big, uneven biscuits, the size of a cat's head, as the saying went. Housewives didn't cut them with rings. They scooped the dough by hand and dropped it onto greased pans, letting them bake tall and soft inside while browned at the top. As canned and frozen biscuits hit store shelves in the 70s, the hand-mixed dough disappeared fast. Working mothers had little time for measuring or kneading, and restaurants found the new kind more consistent. But no mix ever matched the old texture, light from buttermilk, crisp from the iron pan. People still talk about them, yet few under 50 have ever tasted one made properly. For a lot of families, Cathead biscuits are a smell remembered more than a recipe known. 12. Cracklin cornbread. Cracklins, crisp bits rendered from pork fat, were still in regular rotation through the 1960s hog-killing season. Cooks folded them into cornbread batter, giving every slice a salty crunch that paired perfectly with greens or soup beans. When factory meat replaced backyard hogs, the cracklins went first. By the late 70s, few families rendered lard themselves. Without that byproduct, Cracklin cornbread lost its footing. The boxed mixes couldn't replicate it. They were too sweet and plain. But to old-timers, Cracklin cornbread was the sound of winter kitchens, oil popping, flavors deepening in the pan, and proof that nothing from the hog ever went to waste. Vinegar pie. Vinegar pie held on to life longer than most people think. In the 60s, you'd still find it in older Delta kitchens. A bright, tart dessert made from flour, water, sugar, and a spoonful of cider vinegar to mimic lemon. It dated back to hard times, but its balance of sweet and tang made it a reliable treat long after scarcity ended. What ended it wasn't taste, but perception. By the 70s, it seemed poor, old-fashioned, something a real housewife wouldn't serve when lemon juice and boxed mixes were easy to find. Cooks traded practical thrift for glossy convenience, and vinegar pie went the way of true custard. Still, for those who remember it, that tang is unforgettable, the flavor of make-do genius hiding beneath a flaky crust. Molasses, stack pudding. By the early 1960s, molasses stack pudding was hanging on mostly in the hill country of western North Carolina and eastern Kentucky. It was an old-style dessert, thin layers of cornbread or cake, stacked with cooked molasses syrup poured between each one. Families made it on weekends when sugar was short or store sweets were too expensive. Molasses had been a pantry staple for generations, but by the 70s, bottles of corn syrup and pancake syrup lined every grocery shelf. People started turning up their noses at anything that tasted old-timey or bitter. The layer pudding faded quietly, remembered only when someone would dig through a church cookbook and say, "Now Mama used to make this." Like a lot of Depression-era holdovers, its last stand was in kitchens where grandmothers still cooked by feel instead of by recipe cards. 15. Chow. Through the 1960s, a jar of chow relish sat on nearly every southern table. A mix of chopped cabbage, peppers, onions, and a tangy, spiced vinegar syrup. It added bite to beans, greens, and buttered cornbread. Every region had its own version. Sweet in East Tennessee, hotter down in Alabama, mustard-tinged along the Carolina coast. Canning vegetables at home started falling away in the 70s as grocery pickles replaced garden relishes. Younger families stopped planting those big summer gardens, and mass-produced condiments took their place. The last jars came from people who refused to waste the tail end of the harvest, still chopping cabbage in late August, filling the house with the sharp smell of vinegar. Today, chow has made a small comeback in boutique stores, but not the kind that used to stain old mason jar lids rust brown on a farmhouse windowsill. Souse meat. Souse meat, or hog's head cheese, was still showing up in corner groceries well into the 1960s. It came from the last echoes of whole hog butchering when every part was used. The head was boiled down until the meat loosened from the bone, then chilled into a loaf with vinegar and spices. Sliced cold, it served as quick protein for working men's lunches. But as meatpacking plants industrialized, Souse lost its audience. People wanted clean, uniform cuts, not the reminder of where food came from. By the mid-70s, the few local butchers who still made it were aging out, and younger customers chose bologna or luncheon loaf instead. It lingered longest in the deep delta, where families treated it like a bridge between struggle and sustenance, something you ate because waste was never an option. 17. Boiled custard. Before store-bought eggnog, Southern families made boiled custard by hand. Milk, sugar, egg yolks, and vanilla gently cooked until thick enough to coat a spoon. It was a Christmas tradition in both white and black Southern households through the 1960s, served cold in punch glasses beside pound cake or cookies. As home cooking shrank, store cartons labeled eggnog took over. Most used thickeners and flavoring instead of eggs. Older Southerners never quite accepted the swap. They said the carton version was too heavy, too fake sweet. By the 1970s, the true custard recipe was reserved for stubborn grandmothers who refused to hand holidays over to the dairy case. Even now, its real flavor, light, silky, warmed by nutmeg instead of buried in it, only lingers in memory and a few yellowed church newsletters. Corncob jelly. In the lean years before and after the war, Thrifty cooks learned to make jelly from corn cobs boiled with sugar and pectin, a honey-colored spread that tasted faintly like caramel corn. In rural Arkansas, Missouri, and North Mississippi, folks still made it in the 1960s, mostly as a way to use what was left from summer canning. By the 70s, commodity foods had replaced that kind of ingenuity. Corncob jelly faded under the shine of store jam. Strawberry, grape, and peach, with perfect factory labels. But for those who grew up with it, that pale amber jar stood as proof that nothing went to waste. If you could coax sweetness out of a corn cob, the world couldn't throw much at you that you couldn't make use of. Liver mush. In the foothills of North Carolina, liver mush was still an ordinary breakfast through the 1960s. Made from pork scraps, cornmeal, and spices, it was pressed into loaves, sliced thick, and fried crisp. It had the same history as scrapple, born from efficiency, but the Carolina version carried a bolder, peppery edge. Factories around Shelby and Marion turned out thousands of pounds a week, and it showed up everywhere, in lunchboxes, school cafeterias, and roadside diners. But as fast food breakfast took hold in the 70s, liver mush lost ground. Younger eaters found it too earthy, too old-fashioned. It survived mainly in the corners of western North Carolina that still held on to whole hog traditions. Today, local festivals celebrate it as a novelty, but in the 60s it wasn't nostalgia. It was Tuesday morning. 20. Cracker stew. Cracker stew was old-fashioned even by the 1960s. A mixture of saltine crackers, milk, butter, and sometimes bits of chicken or egg. It began during the Depression as a quick meal for children or invalids. Families who grew up poor in the 40s and 50s still made it. Soothing, cheap, and easy when grocery money was thin. By the 70s, it had virtually vanished. Instant soups and casseroles replaced the need for thrifty milk-based stews, and nobody wanted to advertise a recipe that hinted at hard times. Still, for those raised on it, cracker stew was a symbol of turning nothing into supper, the kind of comfort that didn't come from plenty, but from making do. 21. Sugar butter sandwiches. In rural schools of the 1960s, a sugar butter sandwich was the definition of simple economy. White bread spread with margarine or real butter and sprinkled with sugar. It was a treat when cookies were too expensive or lunchboxes looked too bare. Kids ate them on long bus rides or before walking to the fields after school. By the next decade, they'd been replaced by store-bought snack cakes and peanut butter cups. Mothers stopped admitting they'd ever packed sugar bread for their children. It sounded outdated, like something from the Dust Bowl. Still, it was a taste every old-timer remembers. The crunch of granulated sugar and the reminder that sweetness didn't have to come wrapped in plastic. 22. Scuppernong pie. In the 1960s, the Scuppernong grape was still the pride of Carolina backyards, thick-skinned, bronze, musky, with seeds big enough to crack a filling. Housewives simmered them into pies, straining the pulp and folding it into sugar syrup thickened by hand. Every August pie carried that unmistakable scent of southern humidity and ripened vines. The 70s brought grocery store grapes and year-round produce shipped from California. Homemade Scuppernong pie felt too seasonal, too laborious. Vineyards thinned, and the vines that once climbed back, fences turned ornamental. A few home winemakers kept the old grapes alive, but their desserts left most tables. It wasn't lack of love that ended it, just a world that stopped following the rhythm of harvest. 23. Sorghum popcorn balls. In small-town fall festivals of the 60s, sorghum popcorn balls were as common as caramel apples. Popped corn bound together with sticky, dark syrup made from local cane mills. Rolled by hand and wrapped in wax paper, they kept for weeks and tasted of roasted sugar and smoke. By the 70s, commercial corn syrup and packaged candy had taken control of Halloween. Homemade treats were discouraged, first for safety, then for convenience. The smell of boiling sorghum drifted away with the end of local syrup making. Where once entire families stayed up stirring the big copper kettle, now the tradition lives mainly through memory and a handful of county fair demonstrations. 24. Chicken and dressing, the old way. Through the 1960s, Sunday tables across the rural South still centered around one meal: chicken and dressing. The chicken wasn't boneless or skinless. It was stewed whole until tender, then layered with cornbread dressing made from scratch. Families used the broth for moisture and saved every bit of meat, no matter how small. Once boxed stuffing and canned soups became popular in the 70s, the process shortened and the flavor changed. Cornbread mixes replaced home-baked crumbs, and white meat replaced dark. The dish stayed in name, but the old version, brothy, rich, textured, quietly faded. To people who ate it back then, chicken and dressing wasn't a holiday recipe. It was what you made when Sunday was the only day everyone sat still, long enough to eat together. 25. Rice pudding. Before instant desserts crowded the pantry, rice pudding was a standard comfort food in the 60s South. Every cook had a version, some with raisins, others with nutmeg, or a splash of condensed milk. It came from the habit of stretching leftover rice, transformed into something sweet and filling. When boxed puddings hit grocery shelves in the early 70s, rice pudding lost its spot at the family table. Younger women working outside the home had no time to simmer milk and sugar, slow on the stove. The instant mixes promised homemade taste in 5 minutes, and home cooks believed them. A few cafes and boarding houses kept the original alive, baked firm with a brown crust. But to most, the old pudding became a memory folded between Sunday meatloaf and pot roast. 26. Tomato aspic. Tomato aspic, that shining red mold of gelatin and vegetables, still sat proudly on mid-century Southern tables. Women's club luncheons in the 60s served it with mayonnaise or shrimp, a holdover from an earlier belief that anything molded looked elegant. But by the late 70s, it had become a symbol of dated taste, a dish people admitted making because Mother always did. What killed it wasn't just fashion. It was refrigeration and time. Aspic took hours to set and careful handling to serve. Most home cooks switched to casseroles that baked in half the time. Still, for those who remember it, tomato aspic is inseparable from a certain kind of table. Iced tea in crystal, deviled eggs on platters, and the sound of bridge cards being shuffled beside a plate no kid wanted to touch. 27. Deviled eggs with minced olives. By the 1960s, deviled eggs weren't new, but each family had its twist. In parts of Mississippi and Tennessee, chopped green olives were mixed in with the yolks, giving the filling a tangy bite. They were the reliable dish for every church supper and funeral meal. Tidy, portable, familiar. The 70s saw mayonnaise brands and pre-mixed salad dressings take over the recipe, making it sweeter and creamier. The olive version lingered only with older women who refused to change their ratios. Eventually, even the serving trays, those round dishes with 12 dimples, stopped showing up at gatherings. What once represented the heart of Southern hospitality became a shorthand for nostalgia. Yet bite into one made right. and you'll know why they rarely lasted past the first pass of the plate. 28. Fried okra salad. In the late 60s, summer kitchens often repurposed leftover fried okra into what was called okra salad, cold pieces mixed with onion, tomato, and a splash of cider vinegar. It wasn't written down much. It was just a way to stretch supper another day. The tangy dressing softened the crisp okra, turning fried food into something refreshing without waste. As fast food and freezers took over, that sort of repurposing disappeared. Nobody made enough fried okra at home to have leftovers, and salads turned toward lettuce and bottled dressing. The flavor, smoky, vinegared, and bright, told of a time when cooks measured thrift by creativity, not by coupons. It's a dish rarely missed because few even knew it had a name. 29. Cold oven pound cake. By the 1960s, most Southern churches had at least one woman known for her pound cake. Dense, vanilla-rich, baked low, and slow in a tube pan. The cold oven method meant you slid it into a cold oven, then turned the dial, letting the cake rise as the heat climbed. It was a holdover from older gas and wood stoves that didn't heat evenly, but it gave the crumb a different texture. Crisp crust, tender inside. As boxed mixes and new non-stick pans swept through kitchens in the 70s, the technique sounded outdated, even strange. Recipes called for preheated ovens now. Still, the last of the true cold oven cakes carried a particular smell, butter and sugar cooking together for an hour and a half, that became tied to funerals, homecomings, and whenever good manners required showing up with something that kept. When the women who'd memorized that slow rhythm passed on, the method mostly went with them. Field pea salad. Before pasta salads and ranch dressings ruled picnics, many Southern cooks made field pea salad. In the 60s, it was common at reunions. Cold black-eyed or Crowder peas mixed with onion, peppers, and a spoon of pickle relish bound with a little mayonnaise or oil. It was hearty enough to sit outside on a picnic table all afternoon without spoiling, and cheap enough to feed a crowd. By the mid-70s, boxed pasta, canned peas, and powdered dressing packets became the new salad staples. The field pea version slipped into obscurity, remembered mostly by the women who still shelled their own peas by the bushel each summer. If you find a handwritten recipe today, the grease stains usually tell the story. Made often, eaten by everyone, replaced by nothing quite as honest. By the end of the 1970s, the South had stepped firmly into the modern age. Microwaves hummed, margarine tubs filled refrigerators, and supper took 20 minutes instead of 2 hours. The old foods didn't vanish all at once. They lingered quietly, from memory to memory, until the cooks who knew them stopped measuring by hand. Each one of these dishes carried more than flavor. They carried evidence of time, church bells, canning days, the rhythm of lives that revolved around the kitchen rather than running past it. The recipes themselves may be lost, but the instincts that made them, thrift, patience, community, still live where cast iron pans hang and bacon grease jars haven't yet been thrown away. That's where the South still remembers what it tastes like to come home.